To listen to the extended version of this episode, support us on patreon.com/forthewild. Hello and welcome to For the Wild podcast. I'm Ayana Young. Today we are speaking with Jarod K. Anderson.
I just kind of feel like those insidious fingers of our cultural narratives sneak in to even our well-meaning narratives of progress, because the destroyer is romanticized and the healer and the grower and the caregiver is not in so many of the dominant narratives.
Writer, poet, and podcaster Jarod K. Anderson, creator of the Crypto Naturalist podcast, has built a large audience of readers and listeners with his strange, vibrant appreciations of nature, ranging from optimistic contemplations of mortality to appreciations of single-celled organisms. Jarod is forever writing love letters to the natural world. Well, welcome, Jarod. It's so lovely to be having this conversation with you on these winter days, although slightly different temperatures where we're at. Feels good to have some deep conversations during this time of year.
Thank you. It's really lovely to be here. I feel the same. This feels like a meditative time of year.
Absolutely. Very inward. It's a good time for reading poems and books, and I actually wanted to start off by reading a poem from your book of poetry, The Field Guide to the Haunted Forest, called Woodland You, where you write, quote, "It's easy to look at the contours of a forest and feel a bone-deep love for nature. It's less easy to remember that the contours of your own body represent the exact same nature. The pathways of your mind, your dreams, dark and strange as sprouts curling beneath a flat rock, your regret, bitter as the citrus rot of old cut grass. It's the same as the nature you make time to love, that you practice loving, the forest, the meadow, the sweeping arm of a galaxy. You are as natural as any postcard landscape and deserve the same love." End quote. Oh, yeah, this poem, it really seems to capture so much of what your work details. And as we begin, I want to specifically think through what the practice of loving may mean for us when it can be difficult to muster the strength to love, and be that when it feels like the earth is slipping away through climate change, or when we ourselves are not deserving or feel not deserving.
Yeah, that's one of those poems that sometimes I think of as a bit of a thesis statement or a mission statement for my work in general, because I'm somebody who suffers from lifelong chronic major depression and anxiety and a bundle of other mental challenges. So I very much empathize with the idea of having trouble mustering up love for oneself. But in that sense, I find nature instructive, because I have found that many of us who struggle with mental illness can summon sort of a generosity of spirit and love for the natural world. Even if it's difficult to see my own worth from time to time, depending on where I am in my mental health journey, I can always walk in the woods and feel sort of a broad sense of gratitude and wonder. And in that sense, and in many senses, I feel like the nature is medicinal when we come to it with intention to notice, intention to listen, and intention to learn. And so I know what it feels like to love nature in a generous and unconditional, natural, effortless sort of way. So I don't think it takes too many steps to then realize my own connection to the natural world. I'm a messy, organic thing that is also part of cycles and change and a constant ebb and flow, give and take. And so, in so much as I know what it is to apply love and generosity and admiration to nature, uh, with a little effort of will, I find that I can take that lesson and use it to find new ways to love myself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sometimes I think it's so cliche when we're like, oh, to love the earth is to love ourselves. The earth body is our body. And maybe that's just my own resistance to feeling deserving of the same love that I have for the earth. And that sometimes I want to be misanthropic towards myself and think, you know, the earth is so pure and I'm tainted, or these stories that I think a lot of us tell ourselves right now, especially right now, because we're not in intact cultures where we have the type of social support that we may have once had, or like the anxiety that you brought up. I know so many of us feel lost and confused and not connected to a purpose or to a type of even like an inner knowing of spirit. And so I know this is resonating with me. I could imagine it resonating with a lot of folks. And I'm trying to imagine you as you're working through your mind and heart and what practices you have. And maybe if you want to share with us what you do for yourself when the anxiety comes up, or when you find it hard to love yourself, or even find it hard to love the earth, or maybe what we've done to the earth as humans in this time. Like, I think I'll just give a quick example. When I was really falling in love with the forest, specifically of the Pacific Northwest, I would go into old growth forest. And I think that concept of purity, and maybe that comes from like a white supremacist, a reductionist background. I was like, ooh, like you're pure and you're old growth and you're this virgin forest, and I'm so in love with you, and you're just incredibly wise and beautiful. And then I'd go into a plantation forest or a third growth forest or a clear cut, and I'd feel like, wait, like, no, not you. Or, the drought is here and your leaves are crunchy and this isn't. And maybe it's almost a reflection of like those landscapes that are harder to love is a connection to the harder to love parts of myself. So I don't know, just to kind of, I'll pause myself there and see what that sparks in you.
You're just touching on a lot of things that I think about a lot. And I think there is overlap behind that sort of purity culture that has touched a lot of us. At least I can speak for myself growing up here in the US and in the Midwest specifically. And I think that connects to what you said earlier about the difficulty of feeling that ourselves, that we are tainted, that we are too tainted in a variety of ways to think of the earth as family as anything but sort of a toxic positivity, poster on a wall at an office. But I think these things are tied to the same thing, which is this insidious kind of cultural baggage that we all internalize, I think, and we do it unconsciously at first, but that defines for us how we achieve worth or merit within our own identities. And that's the purity thing. But it's also, the artifacts of that in my own life are sort of this work ethic and this sort of capitalist productivity model. Am I successful? How much money do I make? What's my job title? These are the sorts of ways in which the story we learn to tell about our identity starts to erode the sense that, that you can go into an old growth forest and somehow that feels pure and correct, but it's difficult to apply that to yourself. Well, why? Um, it comes down to this sense of worth, right? We are often taught what worth is when we are young through our cultural stories. A lot of us seem to understand that a 2-year-old child has intrinsic worth that has nothing to do with merit or achievement or success. and yet then struggle to apply that same concept to ourselves. Or that, new growth forest is somehow less than old growth forest. Why? Well, because we're focusing on a narrative that that new growth forest is an aftermath, and our mind settles on the disasters, not the growth. I wrote a poem. If you don't mind, I'll read here quickly, from Field Guide to the Haunted Forest, called Unscripted. This sort of touches on what we're talking about. Unscripted. We all consume so many purposefully crafted stories that it's easy to forget life doesn't follow conventional narrative structure. We can't wait for our climax. We don't have character arcs. We live and then we don't. There is no culmination in success or failure. We're not curated collections of achievements or mishaps. Don't fear you won't be good enough. Just be here, present in this dance between joy and sorrow. The plot is happening now. Today is the story of you and me. And, I love stories. Of course, I love language. I'm a writer. But stories aren't real life. It's sort of the old saying that the map is not the territory. The stories, we tell ourselves stories about ourselves. Essentially, that's what I think identity is, contextualizing ourselves by telling a story of ourselves. Stories are how we understand the world, sharing narratives with one another. And that's wonderful. But the downside of it is that if you grow up hearing a certain kind of story, that the good guys are the ones who are successful and productive and rich and own things, well, that becomes our default of how we model worth and success in ourselves, which is a construct. It's a culturally created construct. And we forget that. So we begin to feel worthless if we don't match the construct, if we can't fit ourselves into the template of an identity story that we're told over and over again. And going back to that Woodland U poem, I think that's why the nature metaphor is not just a cliche. It's we have different narrative expectations, or sometimes no narrative expectations, for seeing a sunset or seeing, a particularly gorgeous oak tree growing in a field. So we know how to love sort of a natural occurrence. And then, it's just literally true that we are also a natural occurrence in every real way that matters. And yes, climate change is disastrous and will present so many terrible challenges and losses and tragedy, but that's nature too. I always am careful when I say this, because I am definitely not advocating sort of a passive looking on approach to such things. But I am saying that endings and tragedy and messiness are not a reason to abandon the love or the hope or that instinctual feeling of worthiness that we get when we come to a lakeshore or look at a starry sky or glimpse a deer. Those things are not diminished by the fact that there are man-made catastrophes here and on the horizon. Those catastrophes do not need to be catastrophes of love or worth or meaning or hope. There is, of course, work to do, but we get into that sort of scary purity artifact of so many of our cultures when we think, well, maybe the work's not worth it now because mistakes have been made, tragedies have happened, losses have happened. Maybe this version of nature isn't worth my love or respect or attention because now it's sullied and will be sullied forever. That's falling into that dichotomous thinking narrative that is poisonous to so many of us in so many ways. both in terms of our identities and our worldviews.
That was beautiful. And I am wondering if you're open to it. I'd love to hear your thoughts on how masculinity weaves into some of the threads we've been pulling on. And I'll just leave that totally open because I feel like there's so many things to say about that.
I think it's huge. And it's one of the subjects that I'm very preoccupied with, especially as somebody who grew up in, sort of a traditional American Midwest Rust Belt, small rural town kind of environment. It's a tragedy that I have had so many male friends in my life that not only do not seem to have the tools to enjoy the connections that come through vulnerability and the emotional work that sometimes it takes to build deeper relationships with others and ourselves. And, it's not just that a lot of these folks were denied the tools through the cultural expectations, but, the project of acquiring those tools was seen as somehow taboo or a way to become weak or less than or something other than masculine. And it's something that I've dealt with my entire life, the tension between those expectations and what I am. I remember I won a statewide poetry contest when I was in the 5th grade, and I had to miss a football practice to go to the banquet. And, explaining why I had to miss to coaches, with teammates around. It was like I was telling them that I had to miss because I was being abducted by aliens that day. There was just no cultural script to even navigate that, except that anything that is other and sort of traditional American masculinity is often sidelined or met with, at best playful teasing and at worst hate and derision and being ostracized. So I've always felt like I have operated in sort of a strange liminal space where I love weightlifting. I was a boxer, but I have written nature poetry for 30 years. And it's another one of these times when I feel like narrative becomes a trap if you don't constantly interrogate it, if you don't have a conversation with it. Because there will always be a ready-made, prepackaged, store-bought narrative for anything you want, identity or morality. You can always just grab the first one off the shelf. And people don't seem to understand what they give up by taking that convenience. I know that my life is richer for being able to speak openly about my mental health struggles, about my vulnerability and uncertainty, about my own sense of worth, about being vulnerable in love, in the human yearning for connection and self-expression and creation. Do I also like to talk about the bench press? Sure. And it's just it sometimes always feels so tragic to see peers and friends and loved ones bullied by a cold, dead narrative into shrinking themselves into only certain little corners of human experience. And so I do all this writing in social media, and every once in a while I like to post a picture of myself. And partly I'm doing it to say, like, hey, here's a here's a man doing these things. And inevitably I always get comments, oh, I thought you were a woman. And it's like, oh yeah, that's because I'm being thoughtful and empathetic in a open public context. So it's a conversation that is important to me and that I want to have. And it's another one of those big, sort of like the purity narrative thing conversations that I feel like the only way we fix it is through intentionally rejecting it. And then in my case, I think the thing I can do is be a visible example of another way to interact with the world and myself. Yeah. And I just sincerely and earnestly hope it helps someone. Because, yeah, growing up, there were so many ways in which I kind of had a general sense that I didn't fit narratives. And I know this is true of so many folks, but I think it would have been helpful to me to have other examples of sort of whole and functional lives that had the same sorts of interests and loves and struggles that I had. So, I feel like at the least I have an obligation to try to, with the visibility that has come from my writing and social media following, I feel an obligation to at least be a visible example of somebody who rejects traditional narrative expectations of what masculinity is and how it should be performed.
Yeah, I think it really shows how multidimensional we all are. And even those of us who outwardly seem like we do fit those molds, there's so much more to us than either what meets the eye or even what we think we are. And we're also always changing. I think that's part of the molds to me that's an issue, is that the molds are really stagnant. It's like, okay, this is what you are and this is your role and this will be you forever. But I've found, even for myself, of course, in a lot of ways, I've kept the same values, and I think there's core elements that have stayed steady. But I hope that as we start to shift the dominant culture, we give each other and ourselves more space to shift and grow and be multidimensional creatures. And give ourselves a space of that creativity, too. It's kind of like, and we've seen this time and time again, when we repress ourselves with these hard rules, we end up doing really weird things. It's not good for us. We do all sorts of strange things when repression and purity culture come into play. But I just thought of this, and maybe we could play with this thought for a minute, because I think there's a real difference between repression and limits, where it's almost like something about the dominant culture is like, don't repress, even though it's saying repress yourself, it's also saying like, don't repress yourself, be whoever you want to be, do whatever you want to do, buy whatever you want to buy. Where I'm like, well, hold on, let's clarify for a minute, because the earth has limits, and that's a beautiful thing. To have limits, to have boundaries, it's true. And I think respecting the earth's limits has been something we haven't done in this dominant culture, and therefore we're dealing with so much extinction and climate chaos and so on and so forth. But I almost wonder if capitalism has kind of bamboozled us, where I feel like repression is more of maybe an issue around repressing our spirit or some type of inner expression, where, I don't know, do you see where I'm going with this? I don't want to keep going if it's getting too out there.
Yeah, and I think this ties into the other things we've been talking about. So I was sort of a non-traditional first generation student who studied literature. I did a bachelor's and then went and did a master's and taught college English. And right around the time I'd been teaching for a few years, I'd been accepted to a couple PhD programs and decided I didn't want to do this anymore. That I loved writing in words, but I didn't actually like grading 300 essays a day as my day job. So, armed with degrees in writing, I switched to marketing. And so a lot of the study of marketing is the discussion of, brands. And to the point you were making, a brand, often folks think of it as a logo, etc., a font. But the core of a brand, what people selling things want to do is define what you think about yourself when you use the product. So like Apple, for example, what Apple wants from the Apple brand is for you to feel sophisticated or fancy when you are engaged with somebody who's sort of like plugged in and maybe tech savvy. What they're trying to do is sort of engender this sense of pride, this identity connection, that part of my identity is to be an Apple user. And so it attaches to everything else we've said of like these sophisticated firms with billions of dollars to put behind this research. What they want is to have an attractive, ready-made piece of identity for you to consume, for you to spend money on. And they're good at it. And nobody really teaches anybody how to defend against it. So it's like in the struggle between consumer and product, all of the deck is stacked for the products in terms of, their facility and knowledge and sophistication with crafting narratives. And the fact that, we don't educate the consumer because the consumer's job is to buy things. And, so much of our civilization is set up on everyone kind of nodding and smiling and accepting that belief that, yes, buying things is part of my identity. And so I see this reflected sometimes in messages I get. I get lots of messages every day. And a genre of them that I get is, hey, I'd really like to write poetry like you do. How do I do that? And there's a lot of different flavor of that message. But that message is asking for permission to, like, what do I need to have this identity? And I think the question reveals so much, because the question is like the purity culture thing. How do I do this legitimately? Because come on, how. Enjoy poetry and then play with language and write poetry. Like that's essentially the core advice I send back. But the question is, how do I do it legitimately in a way that, what is the Apple product I can buy of becoming someone who writes poetry? And people get confused and even a little uncomfortable when there isn't a thing, when it's something that you give yourself permission to do. And then, of course, you will always see people trying to sell the legitimacy, and people spend so much money on degrees and workshops and books. And I'm not saying there's no value to that, but at the end of the day, how you become a poet is you write poetry a lot. You read a lot and you write a lot. But there is this baked in preoccupation with, okay, but how do I really do it? How do I do it in the context I understand, which is the context of buying approval, of buying legitimacy for my identity? And it's funny, poetry itself teaches us that limits are often nourishing. There's a reason poets through the centuries have loved strict forms like sonnets and Shakespeare with iambic pentameter, and trying to take an idea and find a way to express it well within limitations. Even sort of the free verse sort of poetry I write, well, there's a reason it is small on a page. It's because the challenge is to express a big idea in a small space, thinking about kind of economy of language and which words really matter. And the limitations themselves are what kind of prompt growth and satisfaction and that feeling of meaning. But limits as a virtue is definitely not part of the kind of prevailing cultural narrative that many of us were raised in. Both in, as you said, the you can do anything, express yourself way. But the subtext of that we all, I think, understand is like, you can do anything, express yourself through buying, through being productive, through ways that we all kind of know are the correct ways to be successful. And it eats at people. I mean, it's another reason why a lot of folks have trouble with self-worth and that misanthropy toward the self that you mentioned earlier. I actually have a poem called Limits in Field Guide to the Haunted Forest. Maybe I could read that real quick. Okay. Limits. You won't see most of this planet. Under each rock, beneath the water, secrets of air and soil. Can you feel the joy behind this limitation? That there is always a new thing to discover, a new way to grow, is one of the sweetest parts of living, and it's free and inexhaustible. It's odd how much anxiety I think so many of us have of sort of fear of missing out applied so broadly to so many things, but understanding that so much of the world and the universe and ourselves will remain a mystery is something that I think is humbling in a way that is fulfilling and nourishing. Because the other side of that is certainty as opposed to mystery, certainty in spirituality or our identity, etc. And so many people are afraid of the mystery, but I really feel like certainty is what is claustrophobic, is what shuts down possibility and growth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I rambled for a minute there. Did I leave the subject completely?
I really love where we're going with this, because even when I think about what you talked about with freedom earlier, I forgot the line you spoke, but I almost feel like we need to reclaim limits or reclaim freedom, where, of course, these huge themes have been co-opted by dominant culture to be like, okay, well, freedom is you can do whatever you want whenever you want. It's like, no, that's not that's not freedom.
Yeah.
That's called selfish. That's not the same thing. So it's like, what is freedom? What is self-liberation? What is self-expression when it's coming from a place of depth and spirit and empathy and not from selfishness? I don't think we're intrinsically selfish, because also, if you're too selfish, you die in the natural world. So it's not even like, that's not even a good survival strategy. And I think it's really bamboozling when from such a young age we're taught that what freedom is to be able to do whatever we want, buy whatever we want, whenever we want it. Uber Eats at any time. It doesn't matter when. You can get on a flight, you can buy what you want, you can have it delivered. Amazon Prime, 24 hours, no, 2 hours. It's just like, that's what we're sold as freedom. When not only is that devastating the planet, I think it's devastating us.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's leaving us so empty, because we're wrapping our identities around this intense work culture, productivity culture, to get this quote freedom. And then on the flip side, I'm just thinking about when Trump was running, and not that this was ever said, but it was kind of this idea of like, if anybody's putting limits on you, like, that's un-American or something, or like, that's kind of the devil, that's evil. Like, if somebody's trying to put a limit on you, rather than like us seeing limitations and a type is as like respectful. So I just think no wonder we're confused. Like, no wonder we're anxious. What we've been conditioned to believe is so confusing, and it's ecocidal. And it's like, well, if we're raised to be ecocidal, well, like, yeah, we're going to be depressed. Like, that feels pretty like par for the course here. So I wanted to read something from one of your essay, kind of under this theme of how we resist, while we continue to build. And it's from one of your essays, Seeking Peace While the Work is Unfinished. And you write, quote, "It's no secret that we need our destructive mindsets to oppose injustice, fight those who do harm, and speak out against adbusters, bigots, fascists, etc. We also know that social media uses our innate prioritization of threats to hold our attention and keep us scrolling. And yet, I think it's clear that what makes the world and the inside of our skulls a joyful, livable, sustainable place to dwell requires constructive mindsets, building shelter, building community, food, art, education, childcare, science, medicine, fun, and leisure," end quote.
Yeah.
Yes, I'd love if you could speak on that for a minute.
A lot of it has to do with a lot of people who I feel like are not wrong, calling for various kinds of revolution and deconstruction. And I don't think that's wrong. But I also think that if your thing is, say, industrialization of farming and food production and all of the consequences of it, I want to know more about how you feed everyone than how you destroy the industrialized farms. I just kind of feel like those insidious fingers of our cultural narratives sneak in to even our well-meaning narratives of progress, because the destroyer is romanticized and the healer and the grower and the caregiver is not in so many of the dominant narratives. And I think, sort of to tie in with social media, the big destructive impulses trigger that kind of cortisol threat thing in us that also captures our attention. And then if we doom scroll for long enough, we start to feel this soul threatening numbness and malaise. And, you know, folks often talk about the placelessness of social media, that we're bombarded with all of these sort of global sized narratives. And it starts to feel like we are residents of the internet, of social media. And then, of course, it's not a place, and it doesn't have an environment, and we can find community through it, but it isn't where we live. And, you know, we're pulled away from our physical contexts and limitations. I think this might tie into what you were saying. We are creatures of a place and time. And, you know, between the pandemic and the rise of social media, a lot of us are isolated while feeling like we are more connected than ever. But the connection of social media sometimes feels like empty calories, like we're eating sugar cubes constantly, and then thinking like, well, I feel full. Why am I sick all the time? And it's because, you know, we are not being present in our place and moment and doing the work that is not threat assessment or destructive mindset, doing the work of local engagement and feeling like we are needed and useful and engaged in our place and time, and not that we are somehow pulled out into a huge, abstract, unknowable kind of collection of a billion minds. Then it's like we never know our neighborhood. And I mean that in kind of a broad metaphorical way, like the neighborhood of ourselves, the neighborhood of where we live, the nature around us, the people around us. We are limited, finite, small things and creatures. And a lot of narratives, and sometimes narratives that are selling us something, desperately want us all to feel like we are creatures of global outcomes. This isn't me saying, let's be passive, but this is me saying, let's be awake to what we can and can't control. You know, and let's sort of engage in a little bit of radical acceptance about what we have the energy and capacity to do. We can say to ourselves, and I think we should, that I want to be involved in the project of moving us toward justice and sustainability. I think it is also fair to say that I do have the same intrinsic worth as an old growth forest and deserve a bit of compassion, that I deserve to meet myself where I am, that I do, in fact, not have my two small hands on the levers of global outcomes. I like the metaphor sometimes of global outcomes, social justice, climate justice, as being this monolithic boulder, right? And any one person could dash themselves to death against the boulder, not recognizing their own limitations. But that doesn't move the boulder. What moves the boulder is all of us pressing gently in the direction of our values within the bounds of our own sort of capacities and self-love. And, that pressing in the direction of our values is, I think, our obligation. I think the dashing ourselves against the boulder is another way to fall prey to these purity narratives that aren't good for human minds and don't mirror the natural world.
Yeah. There's so much there.
It's a subtle subject, though, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because I feel like someone could hear that and be like, well, we can't do nothing. And it's like, well, that's certainly not what I'm saying.
Mm-hmm.
But it is acceptance of limitations.
But I think those limitations make us stronger. I I think that's another. I don't know why the bamboozle word is in my head, but like this, I think it's another bamboozlement to make us less effective, because when
Yeah.
we're so spun out, whether we're looking on social media or the news, or we're feeling this external pressure to care about everything across the globe, to do something about what's happening here, what's happening there, places we've never been, places we'll never go, cultures we'll never understand. And we have all this pressure to somehow show up and support these issues, global issues. It's like we actually can't.
Yeah.
Like we
Right.
truly can't. And where we do have the most effective power is where we're actual stakeholders, which to me means where you live. And that doesn't mean, and I agree, like this doesn't, it's nuanced, because it's not saying, oh well, if you live in California you can't care what's happening in New York or something, or it's not that to me kind of simplifies it in a way that makes it puts it in a binary that's not helpful.
Yeah.
But when we can understand that, no, we do have limits. Like we only have a certain amount of energy every day. We only have a certain amount of time. We only have a certain amount of resource to give, whether that's like time, money, love, dot, dot, dot. So where are we going to put that? And there's literally so much going on just outside our window, whether they're spraying glyphosate or poison on the kids' park down the road, or whether they're dealing with sewage in a weird way, or whether they're subdividing the last remaining wetland in your area. I mean, literally, it's like everywhere you look around you, there are decisions being made that you have no clue about usually. So it's just not effective to spread ourselves so thin. And honestly, I'm like, if all of us really focused a lot more, we'd probably feel better because we'd be building community around that focus. We'd probably be more effective. And then us as these smaller hamlets could come together in these bigger groups, like, local coming together regionally, regionally coming together state, national. I don't know. These are like, I guess we're really getting into this theme of theory of change
Yeah.
or of how we organize for a better future. And
I think one of the enemies to what you're saying, and I fully agree with you that I think that is the model that works, and not only works but leaves people feeling fulfilled. But one of the things that the dominant culture sells us is grandiosity, and perhaps we don't feel that serotonin hit of grandiosity if we write a letter to the editor in our local town, or post on a Facebook, try to organize um, against the spraying of chemicals in the park. Like, I think people sometimes get wrapped up in wanting to feel that they are part of, no, not the local issue, but the big issue, the grandiosity, and sometimes even the performative aspect of it in terms of social media. And then everybody feels ill in an identity sort of way. And again, it's this destructive versus constructive mindset. Like, you're not going to get 1,000 likes for the quiet work, you know, for the planting a tree work. And yet I'm somebody who, let's say in my creative life, has to really work at not doing this purity mindset, this perfectionism mindset, where I'll get so wrapped up in like a section of a book that I'm working on that if I can't envision it perfectly, I will put it off and not do it at all. And it's this all or nothing kind of thinking, this grandiosity or nothing kind of thinking, that small things or imperfect things are not worth my time. And then that leads to, nothing at all happening in a lot of times. Sometimes I find this sort of metaphor too in terms of writing. You might not be surprised to see that I look at a lot of things through the lens of writing. But if I really don't want to write and there's something I'm working on, I'll often find myself reading about writing, as if that's the same thing. And it's not. If I write a paragraph, that gets me closer to my goal than if I spent 4 hours reading articles about character development online. But that paragraph might be really hard, and those articles might go down really easily. Yeah. I just think that these purity narratives and the way marketing works and the way branding works and the way we are sold constant grand images of ourselves and this sort of toxic self-deceiving freedom that you were mentioning, I think a lot of these things conspire to push us toward these all or nothing mindsets that leave a lot of folks feeling numb and paralyzed.
absolutely. Yeah, I really think you're onto something with the Grandioso or Grandio, like this. Yeah, it kind of taps into like the hero, the savior, the big,
Yeah.
and the humble isn't desirable. And personally, I think the humble, quiet, service oriented person is so beautiful. I mean, the older I get, like, that's what I strive for. I don't want to be the grandiose person out front. Like, that's, like, first of all, like, that's stressful. And it doesn't really get you love. It doesn't get you real connection. It gets you projections and pedestalization. And it just keeps feeding an emptiness.
Yeah.
Um, at least from my experience, what I've seen in, my little life. So, yeah, I think that's a really important thread into all of this. And there's something that I feel like might be an antidote to a lot of this, what we've been talking about that you bring up in your work, which is like the value of the mystical, the magical nature, just the magic in this world, the beauty of science fiction. And your podcast, The Crypto Naturalist, it just has such a distinct feeling. of adventure and curiosity. And I think there's so much we can gain from this sense of transportation. And
Mm.
though what you discussed may be fictional, I think it inspires real awe and relationship with the world. So I'd love to hear more about what draws you to the mystical and imaginal realms, and where stretching our minds to encompass such journeys might lead us out of these kind of dark spiraling holes we've been talking about.
Yeah. I think a lot of what we were saying can, for me, be put under the umbrella of making meaning. Like, I think one reason people are drawn to grandiosity is, I mean, what is grandiosity in the context of social media? It's external validation, from other people that you are worthy or, worth paying attention to. And I think that dovetails with the the marketing thing we were talking about earlier, about like, okay, buying this product is a shortcut to identity for me. So I think the trouble a lot of people have, and teaching and embracing this skill, I think would solve a lot, is the sense that we can make our own meaning and that we are then allowed to take it seriously. And yeah, there's an element of mysticism or magic to that, which, I'm fine with. Like, I think some people have complicated relationships with like the idea of magic, but I keep thinking of poems that are related to this. Let me grab one real quick. I will get more to the question specifically, but this is from Field Guide to the Haunted Forest. Technically speaking, you can look at any human life as the sum of a complex collection of chemical reactions, in much the same way as you can look at any beautiful painting as a simple collection of pigments, which is to say, you can miss the point of anything. And that's a distinction I like to talk about a lot, where for me, so much of science is the what and sometimes the how, but it leaves this huge span of human endeavor that is the why. And then I think folks get uncomfortable with the idea that whatever the why is for you will be correct. And there is a burden to that when, like the people asking me how you get permission to call yourself a poet, there is a burden to that when you think, wait, so I can make meaning and take it seriously. I've been taught that my meaning should be store-bought, or that my meaning originates in consensus. And that leads to the grandiosity thing. And it leads to people sort of apologizing for, having a humble life or small interests or non-dramatic passions, for whatever the value of that is in terms of the dominant culture at the moment. And part of it comes down to kind of the self-love of that original Woodland You, that poem that you read, of you have to love yourself a little bit to take yourself seriously and think that the meaning you make from acts, big or small, from humble interests, curiosity, a pretty rock can make your month, and that's okay if you let it be okay. And part of, my love of fantasy is the idea of world creation. Crypto Naturalist, the podcast, is sometimes sort of really intentionally silly. And I've described that show as real love for fake nature before. And I'm trying to do two things with that. I'm trying to, first of all, it's just fun, and I love fantasy and science fiction. But also, I think it demonstrates something that, we can create our own love and enthusiasm and passion, and that, we can make worlds. And what does that mean? And in terms of it being a metaphor, I bet anybody listening to this could walk 10 feet and find, if not even that, where they're sitting, could find some aspect of nature that is unfathomably complex and wonderful, and that they really haven't thought about. Take the word air. What is air? How many things compose it? Where is it from? Why does our atmosphere have oxygen? What's the history of that? How has that changed life on Earth? on and on and on. And then, we stick a 1-syllable word on it and pretend that like, oh, we're done with it. We got that one. So sometimes, if I talk about a unreal bird that lives in low orbit, and dives into mountain lakes to eat inscrutable creatures, somebody can sometimes summon up wonder for that. But I think what we're almost doing is practicing the act of wonder, of awe, and revisiting sort of the childhood wonder of being, a little kid, and you learn about electric eels and you're young and everything is new and wonderful. So you're just like, oh, cool. And now you've just internalized that electric eels exist. Well, it's bonkers that electric eels exist. And yet familiarity sometimes robs us of that wonder. And so for me, it's like, well, sometimes the practice can involve fiction to get back to an essential truth, the essential truth of being alive and awake in such an awe-inspiring universe, in such a singular and rare world. If I may share one more poem on that subject here, and this is bringing it home to sort of real things, but with the same concept. And this is from Love Notes from the Hollow Tree. It's a poem called Look There. Look there, beyond the parking lot, past the broken pallets and sun-bleached Coors cans, down where the march of saplings meets the ditch lilies, a deer. You know this won't last. You know the site wasn't arranged just for you, that it isn't nature's message of quiet wholeness, that the deer didn't arrive because you needed it to. And yet, and yet, and yet, you suspect it will. It was, it is, it did. And with just a little effort, you'll be right.
Oh, Jarod, that was just such a beautiful response, and I have thoroughly enjoyed pinging this ball back and forth with you. It's been really fun, like this mental heart ping pong. I've
Likewise.
just, yeah, it's been such an enjoyable way to spend some time.
Sincerely, my pleasure. I just looked down at the clock and did a double take. Time flies when we
Yeah.
talk about things like this.
Thank you for listening to For the Wild podcast. The musical accompaniment you heard on today's episode is called Pine Chant, a composition inspired by tree ring growth data and climate crisis by Sarah Fraker and Lachlan Skipworth. To learn more about Pine Chant and their work with the University of Arizona's Laboratory of Tree Ring Research, visit our website. For the Wild is created by Ayana Young, Erica Ekram, Francesca Glassbell, and Julia Jackson.